There goes the button. We're recording. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to listen to Shyama Golden speak today. And Shyama, thank you for joining us and for sharing your work with us today. Shyama is here to give an artist talk and present her work as part of the Worldbuilding class at Micah Undergrad Illustration. And I don't have an introduction to her because everyone here is familiar with her work. So I'm just going to pass it straight off to Shyama. And in the meantime, while the talk is happening, if you have any questions, queries, observations, thoughts, please use the chat screen. We will do a small Q&A afterwards and go into a discussion. But while the talk's happening, please mute your screens. Mute your screens, stop your videos, and use the chat instead. And that's it. Over to you, Shyama.
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I think that the subject of your class is very relevant to a lot of the work I do. And I prepared just a small video to introduce some of my work. I think the animated stuff is some of the most fun and interesting, so we'll start there. I'll just share my screen. Oops. Are you able to see the
Yes,
video?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so this is a small reel of some of the work I've done. And like, this is from my personal work, a show where I combine projection with acrylic painting and wallpaper. So it kind of brings together a lot of the different worlds that I live in. And I'll talk more about this later and go through it. There's like, this is an editorial piece for the anniversary of Biggie's death. And like, I'm combining literally the East and West Coast in the bottom and trying to create this like magical world where he's this sort of figure that's eternal, that's above everything. And this is a piece that's obviously about Frida Kahlo, and this one's a seamless pattern based on kiwis. I grew up in, well, I lived in New Zealand when I was a kid, so it was inspired by that memory. This was for a talk that Spike Lee gave, and I just had a very open assignment, so I decided to draw him as like 5 of his iconic characters in his own films. And this is actually, that was one of the first pieces I drew on the iPad like 3 years ago or something. And all these pieces are from a Slate short story, which I'll talk about more too. And then there's a few patterns. This one's a bunch of conspiracy theories, so it's really cool to be able to zoom into it because you can see all the different things that don't show up right away when you see it as a wallpaper pattern. And I think this is the last one. This is animated piece that I did for Red Bull Music Academy that was basically all of the Detroit techno founders kind of morphing into one another. And it was kind of a tricky thing because I didn't want to like literally morph the faces like Michael Jackson Thriller style. I was trying to do something a little more original. I mean, something that was my own idea. So I came up with this method of drawing line drawings that could then morph each person into the next and say something about where they're from and like the style of music that they're making. All right, so now I'm gonna start the story kind of at the beginning. And really where I started out was oil paintings. Like I've been doing oil paintings since I was about 12. They were really bad at first. But then when it was time to go to college, I kind of chickened out and like wasn't ready to do art full time. So I went to school for graphic design I did that for about 10 years. And so on the left, you see like one of my early business cards where you can tell I was like already wanting to be an illustrator, because my card is not very graphic designy. It's very illustrated. And I started with this whole thing of like Shyama rhymes with llama because people were having trouble remembering my name or pronouncing it. So I was taking this thing that was like kind of I don't want to say a problem, but I was taking like something that I had to deal with in my life and trying to turn it into something that could be fun and be a positive. And then that turned into like the oil painting on the right, which was a personal piece I did. And this was where I started really having fun with like making worlds for things. So I wanted to put this, I just imagined this like nerdy llama. This was from like more than 10 years ago, this painting. And I just imagined this like nerdy llama existing in this world where it's like a chalkboard that's infinite and has all these like flow charts. And so that was where I began, you know, realizing this superpower of like illustration and painting, you know, that you can create your own world relatively more easily than like someone who's in film or something like that. And it just felt really good, and I wanted to keep doing it. So then, you know, these are all like early oil paintings that kind of got me on the path that I'm on. And this one, like after doing the llama painting, I just like really wanted to do more. And I didn't yet know like what kind of ideas to use. And this actually came to me in a dream after like really struggling to come up with an idea. And I just sort of like hovered in this world and like saw, like kind of was like lowered down into the scene and saw this like 1950s nuclear family like eating dinner inside of a dinosaur, and it just felt so epic. Like I needed to draw this, and it like, I think it's like sometimes you're just drawn to certain images and then you kind of realize like what it means to you later. Because I was sort of feeling like these like artifacts of bygone eras crystallized inside of dinosaurs, which are also extinct. It kind of had like a symbolism to me. And so I wanted to do more of those. And this time I did it more intentionally, and I started looking at some images that I was collecting, because I'm constantly collecting reference images, just anything that catches my eye. And I mean, because I think art is always just it is just a reflection of the culture you live in. And like, I am constantly paying attention to, you know, these types of images. And these are all women who worked at Bell Labs in the 60s. And I just found it really striking. You know, they're all working on supercomputers and stuff. And it's just not the stereotypical image that you would see of women in the 50s and 60s. So I was really interested in that. And I put them in another dinosaur, which is also one that I had to research, like this aquatic dinosaur. And that's kind of how that image came about. So then a little more recently, 2014, I wanted to do a collaboration with my husband on something, because he's a writer and a director as well. He's a creative person as well. And we want to do something together. So we like one Thanksgiving, it was in New York City. It was really, really cold. We were just like stuck in the house and just started brainstorming and literally writing down like, what are things we like? And just it's that simple. And, you know, on the list for both of us was like Yeti and Sasquatch and these kind of like creatures. We like really love these legendary creatures. And, you know, on my list was cats. And we sort of like thought, okay, what if there was a creature called Cat Squatch? And like Paul drew that as like a giant cat that's just like really huge, kind of Godzilla-sized cat. And I just thought, no, that's not what I'm picturing. I'm picturing a cat that's actually made out of, like this creature, like Sasquatch, is actually made out of cat. So this was the first sketch of it that was rough with no references or anything. And then eventually I like gathered all these different references, and it took me about a week to do the sketch, which is the longest I've ever spent on a sketch. And, you know, using all these references, I drew the more detailed sketch. And then here's a little time lapse of painting that painting in my apartment there. This was the largest size painting you could actually do in that apartment, because it wouldn't have made it through the stairway if it was any bigger, but that was my goal. I felt like this needed to be a really immersive painting that you would see it and actually feel like you're witnessing the real Cat Squatch as much as possible. I mean, to me, that's like the fun of it. is just like forcing people to be in these worlds that are only exist in my mind before. So I'll tell you a little bit about the actual origin story, because there is a whole world around Cat Squatch. It's not just a painting. And like the story behind it that we came up with was that basically all these cats are running away from home, looking for independence, and they start to figure out how to like climb on top of each other to make something bigger than themselves. And it kind of like resembles a person eventually once it gets big enough. And then this keeps growing, like it keeps scaling up until it's basically like Godzilla size and like threatening humanity. And then the story is basically like how people try to take it down, but peacefully, and return all the cats back home. And like NASA gets involved, and it's like a whole thing. So that's generally the story. And this painting took me 2 months to do. That's also the longest I spent on a painting, but I had a full-time job at the time. So I would just come home every night and paint a couple of cats, and it was an oil painting. So it was definitely a process. And I think this is almost at the end. And you can kind of see just how it was like so many passes, you know, to get it right. And I like messed up a lot of things and had to like start over, and it took a lot of endurance to get through this. Okay, so now that's the actual finished painting. And well, I think it was a little bit later than this, like a couple years after this, I started working on the iPad, because oil paints were just very difficult, like not difficult, but they just take a long time, and it didn't work for like commercial work. Since I wanted this to be a book cover, I needed to actually expand it so it could wrap around the back. And so I added this extra landscape to it. And then eventually I also made it into a sort of seamless pattern that turned into a suit for one of my openings. And here's a couple of sketches from the book dummy, because I've been, you know, mocking it up. I mean, this is something, it's like a huge goal for me to get this done soon. It's been kind of procrastinated because I had so much client work, you know, so much commissions that I didn't get to finish it, but it's definitely a huge goal. And here's some of the scenes I've talked about, you know, Cat Squatch as Godzilla. Okay, now we're gonna go into this whole like large category of work that I do, which is digital portraits and patterns. So I think it was definitely after 2014, I got into drawing these kind of portraits that were very like iconic looking. And to me, it was just a picture I had in my mind of like, how can I draw a portrait of someone that feels almost like a blueprint of them? Like it's the angle, you know, sounds very unflattering because it's almost like a DMV photo, but I think that there's a way to draw that, you know, as an illustrator, as an artist, by looking at lots of photos that actually captures the essence of the person in a way that doesn't feel super sterile, even though the angle itself might seem that way. And I also like that the person's really meeting your gaze in a way that it doesn't feel passive. And the first one is actually a portrait of my friend Maria on the left, and I just drew that for her birthday as like a present. And then it just turned into this whole style that I loved it so much. I kept, you know, drawing more and more people with this style, including, you know, adding some animations. And the portrait of Maria ended up on the WWD stage somehow. I think this was last year. And yeah, here's a few more of those. And actually, the portrait of Lupita, that was done for AARP for their newsletter through art director Diane Holton. And you know, we posted them on social media, and Lupita actually saw that and retweeted it. And like the director of the movie Little, Tina Gordon, saw that, and she got me to draw these portraits of Regina Hall, like for the movie, which was amazing. And they're actually like in the set. I don't know if you can see on the top right. And like I just drew these while I was traveling, and then the next day they had them printed in Atlanta, like framed on the set, and it was so amazing to see them in the movie being used. So yeah, here's some more portraits and patterns for editorial. And the portrait on the left is of Amrita Shergill, a amazing Indian artist. And this is a a typographic sort of artwork I did as a personal work. I had actually made a bunch of stickers that were for social media, like back in the day when stickers were kind of a thing. And I had one that was water the flowers, and it was really rough. And I turned that into this really intricate piece. And here's a pattern that kind of pairs with that. And those were all based on kind of Dutch floral paintings, actually oil paintings, and some more patterns. I just like kept generating these patterns, like just for myself. Cause I love the design challenge of it. It feels to me like a bridge between my design background and my illustration or art, that I, practice. And this one actually was based on a lot of research on, this Peruvian type of landscape that they're called bofedales. And they're like high up in the mountains, where there's these ecosystems where vicuña live and flamingo, and like it just like is a very like interesting like sort of landscape that feels very surreal. And I thought it would make sense for this kind of isometric pattern. And there's always some like a little bit of death or destruction in some of my work, because I think that everything is so pretty, and I just think that doesn't reflect reality. So I like to have something that creates a little bit of tension. Like there's the skeleton there, and there's like the reality of like polar bears eating seals, and all these things that are just, to me, make it more interesting, because I'm kind of bored if things are just only showing everything being pretty, and that tension is just a part of life. And I feel like if that's missing, it doesn't feel real to me. This is another seamless pattern I did for Detroit Movement Festival, and I did a bunch of different things for them, but this was one of my favorites. Just like based on, these characters are all based on people who I saw in photos at the festivals. Like there's like a techno grandma who I thought was really cool. Like I drew her in, and like some of them are the statues dancing, and like I was trying to incorporate just a lot of things that came from real life into this fantastical pattern. And here's another piece I did that I turned into a wallpaper, and on the left is, on the right is at my show, just us taking it down, but it turned out really cool as a wallpaper because it's on Mylar, so it's reflective, and you can actually see your face in it when it's the actual thing in real life. And here's a series of patterns I did during the quarantine. I feel like I didn't really do a lot of self-portraiture before this, but then it kind of just forced me to, because I couldn't like have people model for me as much. So I did a couple of these, and they were also just, a part of me doing something to sort of, I guess like it was a little bit therapeutic, to draw these. And like on the left is my quarantine birthday, which was in April. And I'm thinking like I'm coming up on another one. I bet I'm going to have another quarantine birthday. So maybe I'll fill it up with color for that. And on the right was just like, I think just hair growing seems to me to like mark time. And I'm interested in these things that mark time passing, and especially patterns to me already mark time passing, because it's just this like repetition over time that can be scaled. And this was a piece for the Washington Post for the Women's March. And I tried to, I really did a ton of research for this to try to include, as many different people as possible and tell a really broad story, and make sure it was, more inclusive than a lot of the narrative around, feminism was at the time. And here's some more personal pieces. The one on the left is from a photo of my mom and her sister in the 70s. And I kind of like added these like, they're in Sri Lanka, which is where our family's from. And I remember all these like skinny cats, like they have all these photos with these cats, and I made them kind of repeat in the background. And again, it's like showing time passing, like they're in different positions and repeated, and the same for my friend Phil on the right. Okay, so this was a piece that was for, it was a story written by Nnedi Okorafor, and she's a Niger American author who writes these like fantastical sort of science fiction stories. And this particular one was about a woman who kind of forced to give birth in a shape-shifting smart home in a future Nigeria. And it's during a pollen storm. So it's a very interesting story that has a lot of like evocative imagery in the words. And like, I wanted to, visualize this in a way that wasn't totally literal, because the story is a little bit fantastical in that way. So, so that was the sketch. And then this is my process in general. I just draw a really, really rough sketch that looks kind of cartoony. I'm not really using too many references when I draw that. But then I tighten it up and this is on the iPad in Procreate app. And I like tighten it up, draw the shapes, and then, color it in. And like some of the references I was using here, I like specifically was looking at different patterns. I think they were Igbo patterns. They're from the culture that the character was from in the story. And I was specifically looking at these patterns, and there was one that was a talisman for pregnant women, and that's the one on the band around her belly, and on her waist, and like the different shapes and the different plants and things, they're all like from the story. And some things I had to make up, like the grid is supposed to be, that's a little more of an abstract thing. Like I thought it was interesting to make her almost like part of this technology, because when you rely on technology so much, it kind of becomes a part of you. And that's why she has this like grid on her dress as well. And it kind of blends into the scenery around her because ultimately this smart home delivers her baby in the story. Oh yeah, and here's the animation of it. And these were a couple more characters from the story. On the left is the doctor, who kind of appears as a hologram to her. And there are these like dancing flowers that look like a 1930s cartoon or something like in the story. And that's her baby, actually delivered by a drone, in the story. So this one was actually a kind of recent piece that was for P.T. Anderson, a book about P.T. Anderson's films. And so I was asked to create a pattern that was using native flora and fauna native to California. And the thing is, it needed to have some like little Easter eggs that were from P.T. Anderson films. So those things are kind of woven in there, but you don't have to know the references to appreciate the pattern. That was the goal. It wasn't supposed to look really like fan art. It was supposed to feel like a pattern that like anyone could appreciate, but it has these little details in it if you do know his films. And that's a picture in the actual book. Okay, so this one was a portrait of Arundhati Roy for a review of her newest book, and it was like what the article was talking a little bit about, why it had taken so long for her to write her next book, and the reality is she was doing a lot of work, a lot of activism in that time. So inside of her silhouette, I'm putting a lot of the different causes that she fought for. And also in the background, she sits in the desert where she was protesting the testing of nuclear bombs. And like, there's just so much of the story of her in this illustration that I, needed to research a lot about her life and watch her interviews in order to kind of fill this out and make sure it shows the complexity of who she is. So this piece was, so on the left is kind of like a mood board of sorts, like, and references that I used to create the cover for Fatima Asghar's If They Come For Us. And it's an anthology of poems. So a lot of the imagery in the cover, it really comes quite directly from, her writing, but also there were a lot of things that I had to come up with on my own, like all the different flowers, like the lotus and the other flower, which I think is jasmine, on the other side, they all like represent these sort of national flowers from different places that she's from, because she's from Kashmir and from Pakistan. So those are, places are represented there. And like the roots at the bottom, she talks about roots and blood a lot, because it's about, her relationship to other people from, from South Asia. And so I'm using the roots of the plant and kind of like also making those like veins and like trying to tell that story and continue what she's saying in her poetry. And I mean, there's just so much symbols in this. I'm not going to go into everything, but the background, the sort of flourish that's behind the words, is meant to represent her queer pride. And I remember at one point, you know, I had this like graphic design training that was like, you're supposed to make everything have a lot of white space and be really minimal. And I thought, oh no, this is getting too much, you know, and it was my idea to put it in the first place. But I started to try and dial it back. And the author, you know, Bhatti actually said, you know, no, this is really important to me that you leave this in. And I think it really adds something. And so, you know, that was an example of like, then I needed to go back and like make it work. So I like kind of tweaked the colors just slightly so that everything would feel like really bold, but also calm in a way. I guess that's what I'm always aiming for, is like, I want my art to feel really bold but peaceful. I think that's the best way to describe it. So I got it to that balance, and I think it's so much better for, you know, for having her feedback. So that's just like a thing that I have experienced sometimes, is like people will push me to do something that I wasn't sure I could make it work, and then once I do, I'm really grateful to have had that, because when you're just stuck in your own head, you know, it's not always the best thing. And here's another piece. It's about Edward Dwight, who, you know, almost could have become the first man on the moon. And I thought this was like a really incredible story. My dad actually worked at NASA for 20 years until he retired. So it felt like really, I just kind of grew up watching like space movies and stuff. Those were the only movies I watched, actually, because we got them for free at the NASA library. So this just really like aligned with so many things I care about and was interested in. So I got to do this like animated piece for that, and it was so cool to see it as a cover. And then one of those photos that was on the table, this is actually of my grandmother. My dad was taking the photo. My grandmother visited from Sri Lanka, like the only time she ever left the country. And I'm the baby in the photo. And it just like was a photo that really stuck in my mind. And I kind of like wanted to draw it as I pictured it in my mind, because the photo itself was really dark and maybe not the best color correction. So I kind of revisualized this as a personal piece, and kind of crystallized the moment, like where you can sort of see it in 3 dimensions. And I thought like the blur kind of coming and going felt like me reaching for a memory, and this sort of like almost like dust, like sparkling quality. It just felt to me like a memory. And here's a couple of more pieces that I did. These were covers for Q Journal for Netflix, and the one on the left is for the comedy issue. The one on the right was about Laura Linney, and like she's in the show Ozark, and I kind of like was inspired by the setting of that show, and I, you know, did some research and like found some different photos and kind of created this sort of like vast landscape that would evoke that feeling and the feeling of the show, because they wanted the portrait to be really warm, but the show is actually shot in these really cool dark tones. So I combined this like warmth of the light on her with this like cool like foggy background to create the mood of the show. Oh yeah, that was the animation that we did. we needed to like make, and that was the other thing, the lighting on that like sort of neon loop thing, I came up with that as well, because I wanted to still show that blue light from the show, but I don't really, you know, I didn't want to really light her blue always. So that kind of was a good compromise to do both of those. Okay, so on the left is a portrait of Michelle Obama that I did, again, for Diane Holton. That was also for AARP. And then on the right was a sort of like personal piece that I did just for fun. And, you know, I would say it's kind of like, it's basically like fan art. And I thought, you know, I think that like, I don't do a ton of these type of things that are like fan art, but if I do them, I want it to be something that is like really memorable. And like, I'm really adding something. Like, I'm not just drawing based on a photo that already exists, because then I don't know, you know, I'm not really contributing much if I do that, I feel like. So I wanted to just really have fun with it and like draw her, you know, just like walking on hot lava, just like being really unstoppable. So I just like really had a lot of fun with that. And like, I just feel like I need to do some of these fun illustrations for myself every now and then, because it's just like an outlet. It's just a creative outlet. And this is the cover of a young adult novel called Pet by Kweke Emezi. And on the right is actually like, I needed to zoom in on it for the UK version of the cover. But what I want to talk about here is the kind of world I needed to build behind the character behind her. And she's kind of like rising up from this landscape of the world that she lives in. And in the story, she lives in this kind of in kind of a future Nigeria, and like it's just a very like fantastical world. It's not, it's an alternate dimension. So I needed to just kind of invent the world from the ground up, and this world is very like, things are just very very much more socially conscious than in our actual world. And I thought, you know, what kind of building style would be like really utopian and really like socialist. And so I was looking into, you know, brutalism, and I think that these structures are very interesting. And I was inspired by those, and also looking at, you know, different kinds of buildings in Nigeria. And I just sort of came up with this, and the coloring is kind of like infrared looking, and in the story she's hunting for, basically for a predator. And I thought, like, you know, this infrared color is also very visually interesting, but it also, to me, you know, shows that like she's like hunting she's hunting for something, you know, and at night. So that's where all the coloring and the details come from. And this is an editorial piece of a portrait of Ida B. Wells. And I wanted to kind of, for the background, you know, I wanted to put her, I wanted to make sure, you know, a lot of people like don't realize all of the investigative journalism she did. And like, I wanted to make sure that that was really visible in this. And so I put some of the actual publications that she did kind of like flowing behind her, and they're kind of like connecting, they're all kind of like connecting the dots between each other to tell this bigger story. So yeah, so another way that like I think I engage in creating worlds is through art exhibitions. And this is some of the hardest and most satisfying, I think, work that I do. And this is a picture from a very, very early show from more than 10 years ago in Austin. And like, I would just, like, I had this show at a coffee shop and I really strategically timed it to be during South by Southwest. So there'd be like a lot of people there. And these were some of the early paintings, which I showed you at the very beginning of the presentation. And you can see that they're pretty huge. I think I like somehow like compensate for my lack of confidence by doing like really huge paintings. But I think it's just because I love that it creates an immersive environment that like kind of forces people to be in those worlds. And here's a show that was from, was it like 2 years ago now? That was actually a joint show I did with my friend Mimi, and like she does all these, Mimi Ochan, and she does all these, the sculptures. So she does sculptures and I've been doing more two-dimensional work. And so we kind of created this world together, and it just like, even just the whole inception of the idea was like, how would her work have a conversation with my work? And we just thought that they just actually serendipitously in many ways do really relate to each other, because like a lot of my work, the faces are about identity, and identity changing over time or staying the same over time. Really, identity is, or personality is like repeating the same identity over time. So that's what I'm kind of showing with some of those the faces that repeat. And then her hands are really speaking to how, you know, women can sometimes you know, use their adornment of their bodies, including just some really small details such as like nail art, to express an identity. And here's some more pieces from that, which I'll show you in more detail later. But I also had like a wallpaper wall, which really added to this whole like immersive environment. More photos from that. And then this is my more recent show that I had in Brooklyn right before I moved to LA. And this was in, I don't remember now, September, something last year, September-ish. And this was sort of the main wall of this show and kind of where all my ideas came together. And in the background is a pattern of these women sort of sitting in this mango tree. And really what it's about is the background is showing your identity as you see yourself, and when you're alone, how you experience and see yourself. And then the foreground, the paintings that are all hanging in the foreground are about how you present yourself to the world and the drama and the theater of that. So I was trying to create a much larger statement with this wallpaper background and the paintings being hung on it than I would have had with any individual piece. And here's a little video. I'll just show you like just the very beginning of it that shows the actual space where the show was set up. So you can kind of get an idea of how I'm trying to tell a story with the works and how they're arranged in the space. And that's that big wall, and you kind of like walk through some of these works. There's a mix of digital pieces and physical. That was an acrylic painting. And, it's moving because there's a projection on top of it. So like the flowers and the moon phases changing and the rain are all being projected on top of it. And I think that created this, and the paint is kind of like metallic silver too behind the three women. And that created this like sort of situation where people would just walk in and not know what they were looking at and be very confused in a good way. And that's sort of what I strive to do is create this like magical experience that you don't really know quite what you're looking at. And these paintings I'll talk about in a minute too. I think that might be coming up soon. So this is another painting that was in that show that on the right, you can see a video of it. And it's the first time I experimented with this like mirror. Oh no. What happened? Okay, here we go. I don't know why that closed. So yeah, anyway, this mirrored piece, it's basically like a way of me, again, creating some kind of emotion, a piece that has motion and that you can interact with, even though it's a physical painting. Because I like that I like interactivity, and I just think those things like really add something to a piece if it speaks to what the concept is. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a body of work that I did that was based on these characters from Sri Lankan folklore, and they're called yakas. And you can see that there's like, it's a whole art form that's actually like, it's indigenous to Sri Lanka. And it's so ancient, it even predates Buddhism on the island. And I find it super interesting because people will dress up as these characters that are meant to ward off, they're meant to ward off like unseen spirits that can cause different ailments and even like insanity or, actual physical ailments. And I just think that the performance is so interesting because it's actually comical. Like it's intentionally comical. Like the whole village will get together and watch this performance, which is actually both scary and comical at the same time. And I just find that like very much something that I'm interested in my own work. So I created, I kind of put the yakas in my world. Like this is like, something that's very familiar to me, which is when I went to college, I was going to school in West Texas and, driving between West Texas and Houston where my family lived. And this kind of road trip being this very American idea to put these yakas in that was interesting to me. And this was like myself and Paul in like our apartment in Brooklyn, just kind of recreated so many details about our life here, but in this fantastical world. Like there's a dog that's barking constantly on the right that was real, and there's like this plastic bag hanging on the tree that was actually from our life, and this stray cat and like the mice and all these little details are from real life, and there's like junk mail on the floor. I try to have things that are just like mundane. I just think that those are so interesting to put mundane things into oil painting, things that most people would try to hide. I just find fascinating. And yeah, and there's Catswatch. The painting is actually in our living room too. There's so many details in these. And this is based on, like, I grew up in Texas, and so I grew up like very obsessed with horses. I guess that's not really super original, but I have so many like early memories of my parents went to school for agriculture, and they would take me to like the horse barn where I could actually like pet the horses. And this memory is just so like a big part of my childhood. And like I kind of made that into this painting. And I feel like also this sort of there's like multiple dimensions to this. They're like memories from my life, but then there's also this like healing aspect that these characters are meant for healing rituals. And I just feel like America has a lot of healing to do and a lot of exorcism to do too. So like it all made sense to me to like kind of combine these two themes into these paintings. So here's another very recent piece that I did, which is a digital piece that kind of exists in the physical world. And it's, so I used basically these images on the left are these archival images, which I go back to a lot. I'm really interested in these archival photographs that are like, 100 years old from the very beginning of photography of, different women that were Sri Lankan and South Asian, and just like taking them and kind of putting them in this alternate dimension where things are almost like our world, but not exactly. And what I'm visualizing here is that this is some kind of a transmission from an alternate dimension that we're able to see. And that's why, the eyes are kind of searching around for the signal, and occasionally it kind of glitches out. And it's actually an object that you can see on the right that like feels like it is something from another dimension. And that's also the title of the piece. And so this is the final slide. So I'll let you like think of any questions you might have for me while this is playing. This was a process video of one of my latest paintings. The painting was actually based on a photo that I took when Paul and I were visiting Jamaica, and there were these like amazing giant trees covered with vines, which really did look like sculptural. They looked like people, or you could like see different forms in them. And I just thought they looked very surreal. And I knew, and this was like in 2014, I was a long time ago. And I just held this photo for so long until I recently made this painting during the lockdown. And the video I was like talking over, but the video has I like weaved in Bob Ross clips because I felt like it was very like peaceful to draw all these trees. But that is basically it. That brings us to today. So I would love to hear any questions you all have. And I can stop sharing the screen.
Wow, thank you so much for that immensely inspiring talk.
Oh, thank you.
Just the sheer range and variety and the meticulousness of what you do. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around the questions that I might want to ask, but we could go into what was happening in the chat.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat now.
Oh, you do have a question there, but we don't know what painting is being spoken about.
Oh, yeah.
Brianna?
Did the story come before the painting, or did the story develop as you painted? Oh,
I was talking about the cat painting.
Yeah, Catswatch, I thought. Did the story come before the painting? It did. I think it did. I mean, yeah, it did. Because the sketch, the really rough sketch may have come first. But then by the time it was a painting, the story was already there, like well before, the sketch was made and everything. Like the sketch, the original sketch and the story kind of happened simultaneously.
Thank you. It's very cool.
Thank you.
Other questions, bring them to the chat whenever they strike you. I have one, Shyama. What next? What do you have planned in terms of things you're doing or things you want to do?
Well, I am planning to have another show in October of 2021. It was kind of the soonest I felt safe doing it. So that's going to be something I want to take some time to make some paintings for. It's going to be in London, so I think I will make some smaller works, but not just because of that. I've already been thinking about smaller works because I've done all these big pieces, and I think that there's interesting things I can do with smaller pieces as well that I haven't explored yet. And especially like that last portrait I showed you that has the animation. I want to kind of do some more things like that, and I'm interested in like how, maybe even making like a giant frame around it or something that has a pattern in it, because when I look at a lot of like sort of old like Mughal or like old South Asian painting styles, I think it's so interesting how people would draw, and even like Persian art, like they would draw these really, really intricate patterns around a piece of art that might be like a miniature painting, might be like this small, and then there's a giant field of pattern around it, which I think is very interesting how that can like amplify or like add something to the portrait.
Yeah, and with a lot of those paintings, they also kind of serve to accentuate the story. So,
Yeah.
whatever isn't in there, the flora and fauna exist outside. And
yeah,
I do think that's really interesting too. It's like having a parallel story running along the border.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Shadra asks, are you interested in writing more of your own content to illustrate as well?
Yeah, I am interested in that. I mean, that's definitely the direction I'd want to go. It takes a lot of courage to do that, as you know, and I'm working up to that.
But your work is so like narrative, right? And there's this magical realism in what you do. And I know we've talked about this in the past slightly, but even in adding some sort of written word to some of your gallery work, I think could be really interesting as well, just like some small excerpts here and there.
Yeah.
So everyone, I'm such a fangirl of Shyama's. I own like 3 pieces, and I'm so happy she's here.
Mutual fan.
So I'm actually going to go. I have class in a while, but thank you for being here. Thank you for letting us join, Priyanka. And
of course. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Shadra.
Ifan has a question. She says, hi, Shyama. Thank you so much for your wonderful work and talk. I have a few questions about your digital work. How is it working on the iPad for you when you're used to working at such a large scale? Do you find yourself employing the same sort of process when you paint digitally?
Well, I think that's why I really gravitated towards working on the iPad, because before then I was using a Wacom tablet. I just used the regular tablet that was separate from the screen for a long time. And then I got the Cintiq, which was like your on the screen drawing. And I felt like with those, it was like a lot of work to zoom in and add detail. Whereas with or not a lot of work, but it adds up when you're drawing something for a really long time. And with the iPad, I felt like it was just so easy to zoom in and add detail. That's the thing that like made it all click for me, is that ability to zoom in by just pinching and zooming. And I work pretty high res. I work like at least 5K by 5K on almost everything. And sometimes it's more. So that's how I get that level of detail that's almost like the paintings. The paintings probably have a little bit more detail, but it's hard to say. I mean, they've gotten to be almost the same.
Thank you. Yeah, I find that, I don't know, with the iPad, there's like limitations, especially in Procreate with the layers and like getting it, transferred to a program where you can then animate it. So
yeah,
there's like some interesting things, maybe just technically where I'm not need to do more digging, but I was impressed with how it still feels like the same world and the same rendering, even though you are using these different tools.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, I think that with those limitations you're talking about, what I do is I just basically do a save as, which is just duplicate the file and keep drawing. That way I can like compress things and still know that I have that layer on a different file to go back to. So that's the trick to that. That way I can do a really finished piece with just 4 layers, because I know that I've got those elements separately on an older file.
That's genius. I was like, how do I do this with 5 layers?
Yeah, it's otherwise it would be like really frustrating. I'm constantly saving as, like I have so many copies of everything until it's finished. So that's definitely the key. And I like their animation, actually. You do have to work a little bit lower res. So what I'll do is maybe if I'm drawing a portrait that's animated, I'll draw it the whole way through, maybe at the 5K res. And then I like maybe take it down to like 2500 pixels. And then that's a new file. And then that will be animated, because otherwise, for animation, you're going to need like 20 or 30 layers. So to do a loop. So that's how I do those.
Thanks for sharing.
Neil says, thank you so much for the awesome talk. As a traditional artist, how did you transition? Does your process reflect your traditional paintings at all?
Yeah, I mean, now it's like almost, I feel like I'm constantly transitioning back and forth, because now I'm trying to get back into making my own show. And, I think that I need both things, because to me, the illustration work's a lot easier because someone else is giving me, first of all, these like, there's like these guidelines, and there's, what do you call it? Not limitations, but like structure around it. And that helps me to get something done, because I'm not like, whoa, I could do anything in the world. So it's like easier for me to do the illustration work. But then sometimes it is more satisfying when you do your own, after a while of doing lots of illustration work for other people, you kind of do feel like, okay, I need to see what I can do on my own too. So I kind of go back and forth based on, I have a need to do both. And also working with art directors, to me, it helps me. Like not every time, but a lot of times people have suggestions that make my work better. And reading some of the literature that inspires me, the books that I illustrate the covers for, some of that can inspire me to do something new, or, push my work in a direction I haven't. So I benefit from both in different ways, and I go back and forth. And the process, whether it reflects my traditional paintings, it has kind of merged, because now I do, the sketches for my paintings on the iPad too, because I just gotten so fast at it, and I can just go ahead and test what the colors will look like and everything. I try not to overwork it though. Like when I'm doing a sketch for the painting, I'll try to make sure I don't make it all the way as good as the painting. Like I try to just spend a couple of days, maybe 1 day on it or something, so that it doesn't get too detailed, so that I'm still making discoveries on the canvas and not just like, copying a digital painting.
Awesome, thanks.
Well, I have a question about these worlds that you're kind of providing so much detail for. And Shadra was talking about your very magic realist approach to it. And then we heard you talk about the piece where you were just talking about how you put in so many details from the lives that you and your husband live. And you were talking about how this actually happened, and this thing that you see on the tree actually happened, and things like that. How do you start envisioning something like that, even with the more fantastic pieces? We know you do so much research, because we saw you kind of put up those images, but just marrying the mundane and the fantastic together, which you do, so well. I'm interested in learning how that comes about. Do you relate to things that are happening in your real life and think, oh, maybe I should put that in? Or is it something you plan out in advance? Is it something that happens at the sketch stage or later? How does it
Yeah, I think that it happens throughout, and definitely it can happen later. And especially once I do a painting, then it's big. And, once I do something either high res that's digital or whatever it is, when the canvas is big, you're like, oh, I could actually put something more there. Like, what could that be? And then it gets added to more and more. And I think also, like, one thing that happens is you have an original intention when you start, and you kind of like draw the thing, and then it gives you a certain feeling, and then it might give you a new meaning that you didn't have at first. And then I'll add more details to kind of like bolster that, what it means to me, that may have revealed itself throughout the process. So there's definitely like a going back and forth with that. I do think a lot of the small details don't show up in the very first sketch.
So it's something that kind of makes its way into the piece, as it progresses.
Exactly.
Right. That's good to know. Further questions? I have another question too. What do you, when you're at the research stage, right? You were showing us archival images or photos of architecture, things that you're constantly looking at in order to gauge how you want to build these spaces. What else are you looking at for inspiration? Are there things you watch, stuff you listen to? What's happening while the research is going on?
Well, I mean, I'm definitely looking at the news, and I'm looking at what's happening in the world, and those things definitely influence me too. And I'm just like following things that I'm interested in too, and looking at adjacent fields like architecture and things like that. I think that and textile design or different historical things from different cultures all over the world. I think sometimes people like imagine these future worlds that are just very sterile and like lack any sense of history. And the reality is like, that's not what 2020 is. That's not like what people would have imagined 2020 maybe 100 years ago. They would have thought it's like we're all just, only wearing silver leather all the time. But it's like not, the real world just doesn't look like that. It pulls from history all the time. So I think that I'm looking at a lot of historical things. And that's something in general that I just have become more interested in as I get older too, because I realize like the significance of it more and more.
Well, yeah, that's interesting to think of the historical precedents that we're setting this year for an artist in, 2030 to look at and draw from. We're at 5. We do have time till 5:15. So if there are more questions, just keep them coming. Otherwise, I feel like I could just go on and ask you question after question, but it is just so fascinating to learn about how you're going about these things overall. And especially since this is a world building class, it has been so great to hear you talk about process and research and the things you're kind of accommodating or the things you're removing, like the constant process of inclusion and exclusion that keeps happening when you're building a space. And at least for me personally, that was truly great to see. I did have a question about you saying that you were looking at making smaller pieces now. Do you think that's an outcome of COVID and the pandemic where so much is shrinking?
I don't know. I mean, it was something I was actually thinking about for a while. I mean, part of it is just a practical thing because it's like my house is getting full of paintings. I sold most of them, but then you just have like one left from every show, and that adds up after a while. But I also think that I get bored of when I'm doing the same thing over and over again. I'm like, okay, I want to try the other thing, and I want to go back, and then I'll go back, and then I'll like come back to this thing. But I think that there's different things you can do with a big painting versus a small painting. And I'm interested in doing both of those things. So like, I think where it's appropriate, I will do smaller paintings, and then where it serves the concept, I'll do a bigger painting. But I think like specifically with the show in London, like where I think it's going to go is inspired by miniature paintings. So like, I'm interested in that. And they might not all be tiny though. It could be like, the portrait itself is small, but I'm interested in taking that pattern field, and maybe that could be like 3 feet wide, so it's not totally miniature. It's like a little bit of an exaggeration of a traditional sort of way of working.
Ask another question, Priyanka.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just dropping into your class. So Shyama, I was curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe your process for creating work when you're doing things that are, you mentioned like personal stuff just to, for creativity. And then you have gallery shows. And then you also obviously do a lot of commissioned work, and a lot of the gallery and personal stuff obviously has references from your own experiences in the past. And then, and I'm curious, I guess, at what point you think about, maybe the medium in which it's going to be shown, or the context in which it's going to be shown, and how to make it connect to certain audiences, or do you really just try to make it for yourself and then find a market for it after the fact? And this might be different based on, where it's meant to go, but just, the thought process, strategizing of that.
Right. I definitely do. You know what? The word I was looking for earlier is constraints. And I think constraints really help me a lot. So I think about the constraint of the space I'm showing it in. Usually, I may already have a few paintings done by the time I book a show, but I think about the constraint of the space. Like with the space where I did that giant wallpaper, it was a huge wall, and I think it would have looked almost empty if it didn't have enough stuff on it. So that was a constraint that I was like, well, what could I do to really activate this whole wall? And then I thought of this idea that could actually serve my concept, which is the wallpaper. And so it is a little bit of working backwards. You work backwards and forwards. Because if I were just doing, okay, what do I want to do? Whatever I want to do in an ideal world, I think I would just get lost because there'd be way too many possibilities. So narrowing the space for me narrows it down. Like the fact that the show's in London, I can't do everything. There's some things I just can't do because I have to ship the work. So that helps me a little bit to be like, okay, out of all the million things I want to do, which ones would actually work that I could ship, into this other space? And just knowing that it's the real world. If I were just to design whatever I wanted, it may not work because that space has brick walls. I can't put a wallpaper there. I have to think about the reality of the space I'm offered. And it helps. It's sort of a constraint, helps you and constrains you. So it's both things.
Well, having all those shows, I think also it gives this exciting element to your work that I feel like sometimes, I find that sometimes I lose some of that if I'm really hyper focused on creating things for an editorial audience, and there's more of this, I don't know, fluidity and between the pieces that feels cohesive, but have their own kinds of, maybe purposes or I don't know, places in the world. And so, I wonder also if, as you're kind of thinking about what you want to create, is it really hard for you to kind of balance, wanting to create for physical spaces while also maintaining I don't know, freelance career and finding time to sort of indulge in both of those things?
It's hard. Yeah, because I think now it's gotten to the point where I guess it's a good problem to have, where I'm getting really cool requests for illustration works. It's very hard to say no to those. But I also know that it's almost for your health, you need to do personal work. You need to do that for you. Everybody needs to do it. I think if you're always doing your work because someone else asked you and they gave you the deadline, then I don't know, after a while you just start to feel something is off. It may take years, but it eventually will happen where you feel because you're an artist, you want to express yourself, there isn't this great divide between artists and illustrators that people say. I mean, we all want to express ourselves, and we all have our own ideas and things that we need to get out. So I think that for your own health, you have to do some of your own self-guided work so that you can express yourself and get those things out there. But it is hard. It's hard because, first of all, the personal work's way harder to do. And I think we have much higher standards for our personal work. Even, it's not about the craftsmanship. That part's easy. But it's the concepts and everything have to be, it has to feel like it represents you. So that's really, really difficult. It's much more stressful than client work.
Yeah, it's amazing how we start doing personal work because we want to relax and then kind of get caught into it and then just obsess about it.
Right.
I love that process. Like I'm addicted to it, but it's definitely, I think, an illustrator thing where you're like, I need to relax, and then you start doing something,
Yeah.
you're like, oh my god, and then
Yeah.
you just dive into it.
It gets stressful.
Yeah. Olivia has a question that I missed earlier on, and she says, there's so much variety and vibrance in your work. I'm curious, what is your process like for picking colors? Do you go with a specific palette in the beginning, or do you just go with the flow and figure it out as you go? Do you have a favorite palette of colors?
Yeah, I think that I don't know. As soon as I start making if I have a sketch that's just a black and white sketch, at that point I don't know at all what the colors are going to be like. And it's not like a crazy intuitive thing for me. It's a lot of trial and error for me. I think that some people have like a really crazy skill for color. I have to work really hard at it. So I do, and the iPad helps a lot with this because I'll be able to test lots of different colors. When I used to work, I would paint the whole background red and realize that looks insane when it's a really large painting, and then I have to like paint over the whole thing. And that's how I used to fix those mistakes. But now I can test it on the iPad. It's not 100% accurate though. Sometimes in real life it still doesn't work, the thing that worked on the iPad. But it's a lot of trial and error. And yeah, you asked if I have a favorite palette of colors. I kind of, over time, yeah, I do develop that. And I think that can be a part of your visual language in a way. Like, I think I have this sort of, colors that sort of emerge that kind of like end up showing up in a lot of pieces. And it does kind of help build the world. Cause like everything that I do, even though sometimes they're telling different stories, they do kind of have that palette that ties them together and makes it recognizable as my work. I feel like even the colors that like I painted some of the rooms in like our house, like they are like those colors, and people will walk in and be like, oh, this is like your paintings, and it's like, oh, I didn't think about that, but that's kind of cool that even like our home is part of the world.
Yeah, I think we see that thought process in your exhibitions, for instance, where you're thinking about the space that extends beyond a painting and what else is happening in that space. And also what you're talking about here, about your next show, about wanting the borders to extend beyond the painting and tell
Yeah.
a story, or just extend the story, continue it.
Yeah.
In some ways. You paint a lot of people and creatures, and a lot of spaces. I was wondering what changes, or does anything change when you turn your work into an object of some sort? Like you showed us that piece with the mirror, and there was another one which was the digital piece with projections on it that was on your bookshelf, the one that you were looking at.
Oh yeah.
Hairstyles for. How do you think of kind of transferring from the 2-dimensional to the 3-dimensional when you do?
Oh yeah, well, I'm thinking about what environment it's going to be in. Like when I was working on that piece, there were some constraints. Like there's an acrylic block. I mean, this company makes they make basically like screen. They're called Infinite Objects. They make like screens that are encased in an acrylic block, and you can print a layer over it, and that's what the frame is, that layer. And so I was thinking about, okay, where is this going to be in someone's home? And like for me, I have it on my bookshelf, and I just thought, okay, what would be cool to have, on what I want to have on my bookshelf? And it just feels like this sort of, it's almost like the idea that people had in the 60s of what we would be like today, or something like in 2001 Space Odyssey or something. They FaceTime people on an old computer, and it's sort of like that. It's like kind of, but it's like us imagining, okay, what would people have in the future in an alternate dimension? And so I was thinking about the context of how this object would live in someone's in someone's home in that case. But yeah, I think whenever it's a sculpture, I do kind of think about I don't know, like what world it's going to live in and how is it going to make sense in that context.
And these are all questions we've definitely been asking ourselves in this class.
Mm-hmm.
We're almost at the end. It's 5:15. We can take another question, a last one, and then wrap up. Does anyone have any thoughts, observations, things you want to ask about? All right, it's silence on this. And so we're towards the end of it. I want to end with another question that's kind of related but unrelated. You showed us all the worlds that you create. I'm interested in what your favorite fictional worlds are outside of the things that you
Oh yeah, I actually like, I think the ones that come to mind right away are more recent things, but like I don't know if you've seen the show Midnight Gospel. It's like from the same people who made Adventure Time, but it's for adults. Yeah, it's that world to me is so good. I'm obsessed with that, and it's very much the energy that I try to put into my work. And it's like it's like funny, but also profound and deep, and and it's also, yeah, like they're kind of nerding out on different science things a little bit, and just the mix of stuff there and the humor, like I really love that. So that comes to mind a lot. And Watchmen, like I thought that's another show that like totally blew my mind, the world that they built. And I'm not even like that much into those type of like superhero films, but that particular one and Spider-Man too. Like I'm the newish Spider-Man, Spider-Verse. that also, like even the style of animation and just like where like the relationship of that to reality is interesting to me. It's like this like slightly alternate dimension. So all of those are examples of things that I was like completely blown away by recently.
Thank you for sharing that. Midnight Gospel is not a connection I would have made, but now that you've explained it, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I love it too. I'm very much a fan.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, thank you for joining us, Shyama, and for sharing your work and your thoughts, and for speaking to my class.
Of course.
Could we have a round of applause for this wonderful, wonderful Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, this was fantastic, and we do have it recorded, and I think it's just done so much for the class in general. So thank you for coming in and sharing your words with us.
I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah. All right. I will be ending this meeting as of now. I have a bit of class-related announcements to make. It's 5:19 right now. Let's take a break and come back at 5:30, and then we can resume class from there, all right? Thumbs up reactions if you agree. Excellent. Thank you so much, and thank you, Shyama.
Bye.
Bye. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.